The millionaire's girlfriend humiliated his childhood nanny and his action. Alexander Caldwell III lived a life most could only dream of. His penthouse apartment overlooked Central Park, his tailored suits cost more than most people's monthly rent, and his social calendar was filled with galas, charity events, and exclusive parties. He was the heir to the Caldwell fortune, a vast empire built on real estate and shrewd investments. He was, by all outward appearances, a success. His upcoming marriage to Victoria Sterling was the final piece of the perfect picture. Victoria was a social media influencer and heiress to a cosmetics empire, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ambition. Their wedding was slated to be the event of the season, splashed across the pages of every glossy magazine. Yet, beneath the veneer of wealth and privilege, Alexander felt a growing unease. He'd become increasingly detached from his own life, swept up in a whirlwind of social obligations and superficial relationships. He found himself surrounded by people who valued him for his name and his money, not for who he was. He rarely thought about his childhood, a time before the endless parade of parties and the constant pressure to maintain the Caldwell image. His parents, driven by their own social ambitions, had been largely absent, leaving his care in the hands of a series of nannies. Only one of them had truly mattered: Rose. Rose hadn't been just a nanny, she'd been the closest thing to a mother he'd ever known. She'd been the one who'd bandaged his scraped knees, read him bedtime stories, and listened to his childish woes with unwavering patience. She'd been the warm, steady presence in his otherwise chaotic life. But that was a long time ago. As Alexander had grown older, he drifted away from Rose, drawn into the orbit of his parents' world. He'd gone to boarding school, then to Harvard, and then into the family business. He'd become a Caldwell, in every sense of the word. And Rose, the simple, kind woman who'd once been his whole world, had faded into the background. He still saw her occasionally, at family gatherings or holidays. She was always there, a quiet presence in the corner, her eyes filled with a gentle warmth that he found increasingly difficult to meet. He knew he should make more of an effort, should reach out to her, but he always found himself too busy, too caught up in his own life. He justified his neglect with the excuse that Rose understood. She knew he was busy, that he had responsibilities. But deep down, he knew it was a lie. He was ashamed of how easily he'd forgotten her, how readily he traded her genuine affection for the fleeting approval of his social circle. As his wedding approached, the unease grew stronger. He found himself increasingly irritated by Victoria's constant demands, her obsession with appearances, and her casual disregard for anyone she considered beneath her. He tried to ignore it, to tell himself that it was just pre-wedding jitters, but the feeling persisted. He was trapped in a gilded cage of his own making, and he was beginning to wonder if he'd ever find his way out. He had started to take stock of who were the genuine article in his life, and who was just along for the ride. Rose lived in a small, cozy apartment in Queens, a world away from Alexander's opulent penthouse. Her life was simple, but it was filled with warmth and genuine connection. She worked part-time at a local library, surrounded by books and the quiet hum of shared knowledge. She loved helping people find the stories that would transport them to other worlds, just as she had done for Alexander so many years ago. Her apartment was filled with photographs, not of glamorous parties or exotic vacations, but of family and friends. There were pictures of her late husband, a kind, gentle man who'd been a carpenter, and of her two grown children, who lived across the country but called her every week. And there were many pictures of Alexander, from his chubby-cheeked toddler days to his awkward teenage years, all the way up to his recent graduation from Harvard. She'd kept every drawing he'd ever given her, every clumsy handmade card, every school photo. They were her treasures, reminders of a time when she'd been an integral part of his life. She didn't begrudge him his success, his wealth, or his fancy fiancé. She only wished he hadn't forgotten her completely. She knew he was busy, that he had a demanding life. But she couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness whenever she saw him at family gatherings, so distant and formal. He'd become a stranger, a polished, sophisticated version of the little boy she'd once known. She'd met Victoria a few times, and she hadn't been impressed. The young woman was beautiful, certainly, but she seemed cold and self-absorbed. Rose sensed a shallowness in her, a lack of empathy that worried her. She couldn't imagine Victoria ever truly understanding Alexander, ever appreciating the kind, sensitive boy who still existed beneath the layers of wealth and privilege. Rose's friends, a close-knit group of women from her church and her neighborhood, often urged her to reach out to Alexander, to remind him of her presence in his life. But Rose was hesitant. She didn't want to intrude, to make him feel obligated. She believed that relationships should be based on genuine affection, not on duty or guilt. "He'll come around," Rose, her friend, Maria, would say. "He's just lost his way a bit. He needs you, even if he doesn't know it yet." Rose would smile and nod, but deep down, she wasn't so sure. She'd seen how easily people could be seduced by wealth and power, how quickly they could forget the things that truly mattered. She feared that Alexander had become one of those people. Still, she held onto a sliver of hope. She remembered the little boy who'd clung to her leg, the boy who'd trusted her implicitly, the boy who'd loved her unconditionally. She believed that boy was still there, somewhere, buried beneath the layers of adulthood and social conditioning. And she hoped, with all her heart, that he would one day find his way back to her. She couldn't help but hold out a little hope, as she truly loved Alexander and had for all of his life. She couldn't shake the image of the little boy who needed her so much. The engagement dinner was held at one of New York's most exclusive restaurants, a place where the waiters wore tuxedos and the menu didn't list prices. Alexander's parents had spared no expense, inviting a select group of family and friends to celebrate the upcoming nuptials. Rose had been invited, of course, but she felt out of place amidst the glittering crowd. She wore a simple, elegant dress that she'd had for years, and she carried herself with a quiet dignity that contrasted sharply with the ostentatious displays of wealth around her. She sat at a table with some of Alexander's distant relatives, people she'd met only a few times before. They were polite enough, but they clearly didn't know what to make of her. She was an anomaly in their world, a reminder of a life they'd long ago left behind. Alexander was busy circulating, playing the role of the charming host. He greeted Rose with a brief hug and a perfunctory smile, then moved on to mingle with more important guests. Rose watched him, a mixture of sadness and resignation in her eyes. Victoria, resplendent in a designer gown that probably cost more than Rose's annual salary, clung to Alexander's arm, her smile dazzling but somehow cold. She seemed to regard Rose with a mixture of disdain and amusement, as if she were a curious relic from a bygone era. The dinner progressed, a seemingly endless parade of courses and toasts. Rose ate sparingly, her appetite diminished by the oppressive atmosphere. She felt a growing sense of isolation, a feeling of being invisible in a room full of people. Then came the incident that would forever change her relationship with Alexander. As a waiter refilled Victoria's wine glass, he accidentally bumped her arm, causing a few drops of red wine to splash onto Rose's dress. It was a minor accident, something that could have happened to anyone. But Victoria's reaction was anything but gracious. "Oh, for heaven's sake," she exclaimed, her voice dripping with annoyance. "Can't you be more careful? You've ruined her dress." She turned to Rose, her expression a mixture of feigned apology and thinly veiled contempt. "I'm so sorry, Rose. But honestly, it's not a great loss, is it? I'm sure you have plenty of others just like it." The room fell silent. Everyone at the table had witnessed the exchange, and they were all waiting to see how Alexander would react. He stood there, frozen, his face a mask of conflicting emotions. He knew he should defend Rose, should tell Victoria that her behavior was unacceptable. But he hesitated, paralyzed by his fear of upsetting his fiancée, of disrupting the carefully constructed facade of his perfect life. His silence was deafening. It was a betrayal, a tacit endorsement of Victoria's cruelty. Rose felt a wave of humiliation wash over her, a deep, searing pain that went far beyond the stain on her dress. She looked at Alexander, her eyes filled with a profound sadness. She didn't say anything, didn't need to. Her expression spoke volumes. It was a look of disappointment, of disillusionment, of a love slowly but surely fading away. She quietly excused herself from the table, her movements graceful and dignified despite her inner turmoil. She walked out of the restaurant, leaving behind the glittering crowd, the empty laughter, and the man who had once been her whole world. She didn't look back. She knew that she couldn't stay, not anymore. The pain of Alexander's silence was too much to bear. The look in his eyes, the mixture of guilt and helplessness, told her everything she needed to know. He had chosen his path, and it was not a path that included her. Rose walked for hours, the cool night air doing little to soothe the burning humiliation she felt. She wasn't angry, not really. She was just profoundly sad. Sad for Alexander, for the man he'd become, and sad for herself, for the loss of a relationship she'd cherished for so long. She eventually found herself at a small park near her apartment, a place where she often came to find solace. She sat on a bench, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, and allowed herself to cry. She cried for the little boy she'd loved, for the broken promises, and for the realization that she could no longer pretend that things were okay. When she finally returned to her apartment, she felt drained, exhausted, but also strangely resolute. She knew she couldn't continue to live in the shadow of Alexander's neglect. She needed to move on, to create a life for herself that was free from the pain and disappointment he'd caused her. She started by packing a small suitcase. She didn't have much, but she had enough. She had her memories, her dignity, and her unwavering belief in the importance of kindness and respect. She had decided to leave, at least for a while. She called her daughter, Sarah, who lived in California. Sarah was overjoyed at the prospect of her mother visiting, and she immediately offered to pay for her plane ticket. Rose hesitated, not wanting to be a burden, but Sarah insisted. "Mom, you've always been there for me," Sarah said. "Now it's my turn to be there for you. Come out here, relax, and let us take care of you for a change." Rose agreed, her heart filled with gratitude for her daughter's love and support. She knew that leaving New York wouldn't magically erase the pain, but it would give her the space and time she needed to heal, to figure out what she wanted to do with the rest of her life. The next morning, Rose went to the library to tell her supervisor that she was taking a leave of absence. Her colleagues were surprised and concerned, but they respected her decision. They knew she wouldn't leave unless it was important. She then wrote a short note to Alexander, explaining that she was going to stay with her daughter for a while. She didn't mention the incident at the dinner, didn't accuse him of anything. She simply said that she needed some time to herself, and that she hoped he would understand. She left the note with the doorman at Alexander's building, knowing that he would probably never read it. It didn't matter. She'd done what she needed to do. She'd closed the door on that chapter of her life, and she was ready to move on. As she walked away from the building, she felt a sense of liberation, a lightness she hadn't felt in years. She was no longer bound by the expectations of Alexander's world, by the need to pretend that everything was okay. She was free to be herself, to live her life on her own terms. She didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for sure: she would never again allow herself to be treated with disrespect, to be made to feel invisible or insignificant. She had learned a valuable lesson, a painful one, but one that had ultimately strengthened her resolve. She was Rose, and she was worth more than a stained dress and a careless apology. She was worth more than a life lived in the shadows of someone else's privilege. Alexander didn't notice Rose's absence at first. He was too caught up in the aftermath of the dinner party, dealing with Victoria's complaints about the clumsy waiter and his mother's subtle but pointed remarks about the importance of maintaining appearances. It wasn't until the next day, when he received Rose's note, that the reality of his inaction hit him. He read the simple words, and a wave of guilt and shame washed over him. He realized, with a sickening certainty, that he'd made a terrible mistake. He'd allowed his fear of upsetting Victoria, of disrupting his carefully constructed life, to silence him. He'd stood by and watched as the woman who'd raised him, the woman who'd loved him unconditionally, had been humiliated and dismissed. He tried to call Rose, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He left a message, a rambling, incoherent apology, but he knew it was too little, too late. He'd hurt her deeply, and he didn't know how to fix it. He started to see Victoria in a different light. Her beauty, which had once captivated him, now seemed superficial and cold. Her ambition, which he'd once admired, now seemed ruthless and self-serving. He realized that he'd been blinded by her charm, by the allure of her wealth and status. He'd mistaken her for someone she wasn't. He began to question everything about his life, about his choices, about the values he'd adopted. He'd been living in a bubble, surrounded by people who cared more about appearances than about substance. He'd become one of them, a shallow, empty shell of a man. He started to remember the things Rose had taught him, the values she'd instilled in him: kindness, compassion, respect for others. He'd forgotten those lessons, lost sight of who he was supposed to be. He went to his parents, hoping for some guidance, some understanding. But they were more concerned about the potential scandal of a broken engagement than about his emotional turmoil. "Alexander, you can't be serious," his mother said, her voice laced with disapproval. "Victoria is a perfect match for you. She's beautiful, she's well-connected, and she comes from a good family. You can't throw all that away over a minor misunderstanding. His father echoed her sentiments, emphasizing the importance of maintaining the family's reputation, of not jeopardizing the upcoming merger with the Sterling Corporation. Alexander realized that his parents would never understand. They were too deeply entrenched in their own world of privilege and social climbing. They cared more about their image than about his happiness. He felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of superficiality. He longed for Rose's presence, for her calm wisdom, for her unwavering support. He needed someone to talk to, someone who would understand, someone who would tell him the truth, even if it was painful. He decided to visit Rose's apartment, hoping against hope that she might still be there. He found the building, a modest brick structure in a quiet, tree-lined street, a stark contrast to his own luxurious high-rise. He rang the doorbell, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no answer. He tried again and again, but still nothing. He felt a growing sense of despair, a fear that he'd lost her forever. He asked the building superintendent if he knew where Rose had gone. The superintendent, a kindly old man with a sympathetic expression, told him that Rose had left town, that she'd gone to stay with her daughter in California. She said she needed a break, the superintendent said. Said she was going to spend some time with her family. Alexander felt a pang of guilt, a sharp realization of the pain he'd caused her. He'd driven her away, forced her to seek refuge with her daughter, to escape the world he'd created. He returned to his penthouse, feeling more empty and alone than ever before. He looked around at the opulent surroundings, at the expensive furniture, the artwork, the panoramic views of the city. It all seemed meaningless now, devoid of any real value. He realized that he'd been living a lie, chasing after a dream that had turned into a nightmare. He traded genuine connection for superficial status, authentic love for fleeting approval. He'd become the very thing he'd always despised, a shallow, self-absorbed socialite. He knew he had to change. He had to find his way back to the values Rose had instilled in him, to the person he'd once been, before the world had corrupted him. He had to make amends for his mistakes, to earn back Rose's trust and respect. He started by breaking off his engagement with Victoria. He told her that he couldn't marry her, that he didn't love her, that he'd made a terrible mistake. Victoria was furious, of course. She accused him of being irrational, of throwing away the opportunity of a lifetime, of ruining her reputation. She threatened to sue him, to expose his family's secrets, to make his life a living hell. Alexander didn't care. He'd faced his own demons, and he was no longer afraid of Victoria's threats. He was prepared to face the consequences of his actions, to accept whatever punishment came his way. He knew that breaking up with Victoria was just the first step. He had a long way to go, a lot of damage to repair. But he was determined to change, to become the man Rose had always believed he could be. He was ready to start living a life of purpose, a life of meaning, a life worthy of the love and respect he'd so carelessly thrown away. The gilded cage was open, and he was finally ready to step out. The confrontation with Victoria was even more explosive than Alexander had anticipated. She unleashed a torrent of insults, accusations, and threats, her beautiful face contorted with rage. "You're pathetic, Alexander," she hissed. "You're throwing away everything for her, and nobody, a washed-up old nanny. Do you have any idea what this will do to your reputation? To your family's business?" Alexander remained calm, his voice steady despite the turmoil he felt inside. "My reputation doesn't matter, Victoria. What matters is doing what's right. And marrying you would be wrong, for both of us." "Right," she scoffed. "What's right about abandoning me at the altar? About humiliating me in front of everyone we know?" "I'm sorry you feel humiliated, Victoria," Alexander said. "But I can't live a lie. I don't love you, and I never will. I was wrong to ever get engaged to you. I was blinded by things that don't matter." "Things that don't matter," Victoria shrieked. "Money? Status? Power? Those are the things that matter, Alexander. You're a Caldwell. You can't just throw that away." "I'm not throwing it away," Alexander said. "I'm just redefining it. I'm realizing that there are more important things in life than money and status. Things like kindness, compassion, respect. Things I learned from Rose." Victoria laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "Rose? You're choosing that old woman over me, over everything we could have had together." "I'm not choosing anyone over anyone," Alexander said. "I'm choosing to be true to myself. I'm choosing to live a life of integrity, a life that Rose would be proud of." Victoria stared at him, her eyes filled with disbelief and contempt. "You're a fool, Alexander," she said. "You'll regret this. You'll regret this for the rest of your life." She stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door behind her. Alexander stood there for a long moment, feeling a mixture of relief and sadness. He'd done the right thing, but it had cost him dearly. He'd lost his fiancée, his social standing, and possibly even his family's approval. But he'd also gained something: his freedom. He was free from the constraints of his former life, free from the expectations of his parents and his social circle. He was free to be himself, to make his own choices, to live a life that was true to his values. He knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. He would face criticism, ridicule, and possibly even ostracism, but he was prepared for that. He had Rose's example to guide him, her unwavering belief in the power of kindness and compassion. He decided to call his parents, to explain his decision. He knew they wouldn't understand, that they would be furious, but he had to do it. He had to stand up for what he believed in, even if it meant alienating his own family. The conversation was even worse than he'd expected. His mother accused him of being selfish, of ruining the family's reputation, of throwing away a golden opportunity. His father was more stoic, but his disappointment was palpable. "Alexander, I'm deeply disappointed in you," his father said, his voice cold and distant. "You've made a grave mistake. You've chosen to side with a servant over your own family." "Rose is not a servant, father," Alexander said, his voice trembling with anger. "She's family. She's more family to me than you've ever been." He hung up the phone, feeling a profound sense of loneliness. He'd severed his ties with his parents, with his fiancée, with his entire social circle. He was alone, adrift in a world that no longer made sense to him. But he wasn't completely alone. He had Rose, even if she was miles away. He had her memory, her example, her unwavering belief in him. And that was enough to give him the strength to carry on, to face the challenges ahead, to build a new life for himself, a life based on genuine values, on kindness, and on respect. He knew it was the only way to truly honor the woman who had given him so much. He had made his choice, and for the first time in a long time, he felt a sense of peace, a sense of purpose. Alexander booked a flight to California, his heart filled with a mixture of hope and trepidation. He knew that apologizing to Rose wouldn't be easy. He'd hurt her deeply, and he couldn't expect her to forgive him instantly. He arrived at his sister's house, a modest but welcoming home filled with the warmth of family life. Sarah greeted him with a hug, her eyes filled with a mixture of concern and understanding. "She's in the garden, Alex," Sarah said, guiding him towards the back of the house. "She spends most of her time there. It's her happy place." Alexander found Rose tending to a small patch of roses, her hands moving gently among the flowers. She looked up as he approached, her expression unreadable. He stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say. The words seemed inadequate, insufficient to express the depth of his remorse. "Rose," he finally said, his voice choked with emotion. I'm so sorry." Rose continued to tend to her flowers, her silence heavy with unspoken emotions. "I know I messed up," Alexander continued. "I was a fool. I let my pride, my fear, get in the way of doing what was right. I let you down, and I'll never forgive myself for that." Rose finally looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and understanding. "It hurt, Alexander," she said softly. "It hurt more than you know." "I know," Alexander said. "And I'm so sorry. I wish I could take it back, but I can't. All I can do is ask for your forgiveness, and promise you that I'll never treat you like that again." Rose studied his face, searching for any sign of insincerity. She saw only genuine remorse, a deep, heartfelt regret for his actions. "I raised you to be better than that, Alexander," she said. "I taught you to treat people with kindness and respect, no matter who they were." "I know," Alexander said. "And I forgot those lessons. I got lost in a world that valued all the wrong things. But I'm trying to find my way back, Rose. I need your help." Rose smiled, a faint, tentative smile. "You always were a stubborn boy," she said. "But you had a good heart. I never lost faith in that." "Will you forgive me, Rose?" Alexander asked, his voice filled with hope. Rose reached out and took his hand, her touch warm and comforting. "I forgive you, Alexander," she said. "But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means learning from your mistakes and striving to be a better person." Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him, a burden lifted from his shoulders. He'd been forgiven, not just by Rose, but by himself. He'd taken the first step towards redemption, towards rebuilding his life on a foundation of genuine values. He spent the next few days with Rose and Sarah, helping in the garden, sharing meals, and talking for hours. He told Rose everything about his struggles, his doubts, his newfound determination to change. Rose listened patiently, offering her wisdom and guidance, but also challenging him to think for himself, to make his own decisions. She didn't want to be his crutch, she wanted to be his inspiration. He realized that Rose wasn't just a nanny, she was a mentor, a friend, a guiding light in his life. She'd always been there for him, even when he'd pushed her away. And now, she was giving him a second chance, a chance to become the man she'd always believed he could be. He left California with a renewed sense of purpose, a commitment to living a life that honored Rose's teachings, a life that was worthy of her love and respect. He knew the journey wouldn't be easy, but he was no longer alone. He had Rose's forgiveness, her support, and her unwavering belief in him, and that was all he needed. Alexander returned to New York a changed man. He resigned from his position at Caldwell Enterprises, severing his ties with the family business. He sold his penthouse apartment and moved into a smaller, more modest place in a quiet neighborhood. He started volunteering at a local community center, teaching English to immigrants and helping them adjust to life in America. He also made an effort to reconnect with people he'd neglected during his years of social climbing. He reached out to old friends, apologized for his past behavior, and sought to rebuild those relationships. Some were receptive, others were not, but Alexander accepted their reactions with grace and understanding. He continued to stay in close contact with Rose, calling her regularly and visiting her in California whenever he could. He learned more about her life, her interests, her dreams. He discovered that she was a talented artist, that she loved to paint landscapes and portraits. He encouraged her to pursue her passion, to share her art with the world. He also started to make amends for the damage he'd caused to his family's reputation. He used his own money he'd earned before resigning from the family business, to establish a foundation dedicated to supporting underprivileged communities. He focused on providing educational opportunities for children, knowing that education was the key to breaking the cycle of poverty. His parents were initially furious with his actions, accusing him of being ungrateful and irresponsible. But over time, they began to see the change in him, the genuine remorse he felt for his past mistakes, and the positive impact he was making on the world. They eventually reached out to him, tentatively at first, then with increasing warmth and understanding. They apologized for their own failings as parents, for their obsession with status and wealth, for neglecting his emotional needs. Alexander forgave them, knowing that forgiveness was the only way to heal the wounds of the past. He didn't expect them to change completely, but he was grateful for their willingness to try to rebuild their relationship on a foundation of mutual respect and understanding. Victoria, on the other hand, remained bitter and resentful. She continued to spread rumors about Alexander, to paint him as a villain, to try to sabotage his efforts to rebuild his life. But Alexander ignored her, refusing to be drawn into her negativity. He had moved on, and he was no longer affected by her attempts to hurt him. Years passed, and Alexander continued to live a life of purpose, a life guided by the values Rose had instilled in him. He found fulfillment in his work, in his relationships, and in his commitment to making a positive difference in the world. He never forgot Rose, the woman who had saved him from himself, the woman who had shown him the true meaning of love, kindness, and respect. He visited her often, bringing her flowers from his own garden, sharing stories about his life, and listening to her wise counsel. Rose eventually passed away peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by her family and friends. Alexander was devastated by her loss, but he also felt a profound sense of gratitude for her presence in his life. She had been his guiding star, his moral compass, his inspiration. He honored her memory by continuing to live a life that would have made her proud. He established a scholarship in her name, providing financial assistance to students pursuing careers in education and social work. He also supported the library where she had worked, ensuring that future generations would have access to the knowledge and the stories that Rose had so dearly loved. He had made something good from the ruin of his past, and that was the greatest gift she could have left him. He was no longer the man he was, and he had the woman she had been to thank. He often thought of the dinner, and Victoria's cruel words, and how that seemingly insignificant moment had been the catalyst for a total change, a rebirth, really, into a better man.